Dames en heren, ik heet u allen van harte welkom op deze academische zitting, waarop Dr. Kristof de Witte, benoemd in de faculteit Humanities and Sciences tot bijzonder hoogleraar Effectiveness and Efficiency in Educational Innovations, zich voorstelt dit ambt te aanvaarden met het uitspreken van een rede. Dr. de Witte, ik geef u graag het woord.
Beste decaan, beste collega's, beste ouders, beste familie en vrienden. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for being here at this inaugural acceptance. I'm going to talk in English from now on, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about the effectiveness and efficiency of educational innovations. Education, it seems very similar the way we taught, the way we teach about 60 years ago and about 2016. If you look at those pictures, the way we organize education is in a very similar way. Nevertheless, if you look at those pictures at the right-hand side, so the 2016 picture, there is co-teaching in this picture. There are smaller classrooms than it used to be in the 60s. There are digital whiteboards. There's differentiated instruction. So there are all kinds of innovations in education every day and every moment. And while all of those innovations are rather costly, and they are proponents, they argue that they are costly, but they do have an effect on the efficiency of innovations, and they do have an effect on their effectiveness. Efficiency, we mean with efficiency that the outcomes can be reached with few resources, or that the same outcomes can be reached, that with the same resources, higher outcomes can be obtained. On the other hand, with effectiveness, we mean that the expected outcomes can be reached or are reached. And this is exactly what I'm going to research in this chair. So I'm going to look at the efficiency of innovations and effectiveness of innovations. With respect to the effectiveness of innovations, innovations are nowadays too often introduced at a very large scale without examining their effect. And a very influential report by the Education Council in 2006 argued that we should not innovate as such, we should not innovate all the time, but we should try to innovate just because it matters, because there is effect, because they rely on efficiency and because they matter in terms of effectiveness. So this was a 2006 report of the Education Council, and based on this report of the Education Council, there was the establishment of TIER, the Top Institute of Evidence-Based Education Research, and the Dutch Teachers and Policymakers Academy. At TIER, at the Dutch Policymakers Academy, we tried to look at the effectiveness of innovations by looking at experiments, by looking at quasi-experiments, just to know whether things work, whether innovations work in education. With respect to efficiency, there are also many things to do so. If you look at the rising cost of education, this is here the Consumer Price Index. The average, this is the blue line, the average consumer price index for many countries. If you look at various countries like the UK, like many other countries in Europe, you see that the costs of education are rising at a larger space, at a larger path than the costs of the average consumer price index. So education becomes more and more costly over time. And this calls again for the efficiency issues. Also, with respect to efficiency, there is an increasing shortage of teachers. If you look for Belgium and the Netherlands, for instance, there is a lack of qualified teachers in many subjects, for instance, in science teachers and mathematics teachers. Again, this gives rise to an increasing call for efficiency, because we should try to increase the efficiency such that we can, for instance, teach in larger classrooms, such that we can teach in a different way. And in this inaugural lecture, I'm going to show you a little bit an overview of what I did during the past couple of years. And I'm going to answer the question how efficiency and effectiveness is actually interrelated and how they are intertwined in educational innovations. And finally, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to set a scene about what I'm going to do in this chair and what kind of further research you can expect in this chair. First of all, I looked at resource-driven policies. So we know, for instance, if you look at this graph, we know that education matters. Education and the quality of education in particular, so the quality measured by the learning outcomes of students, it matters for economic growth. So this is on the vertical axis, you see economic growth of countries. On the horizontal axis, you see the conditional test scores of countries. And there's a strong positive relationship between the test scores of countries, the conditional test scores, so conditional upon a lot of explanatory variables, and the conditional growth of countries. So we know that education matters and that quality of education is very important. So the question is, how can we improve the quality of education? How can we improve test scores of students such that we have a higher economic growth over time? And the first natural thought is, of course, we should do at resource expansion. So we should invest more in education. And I work with Benny Gees and Katrien Slondos. I looked at resource-driven policies. So we examined, do resource-driven policies matter in order to increase the performance of students and the education quality as such? And we distinguished two kinds of sources. So first of all, we looked at educational funding, additional funding, whether it leads to effectiveness, so whether it leads to real education improvements, increased student performance, or on the other hand, to grade inflation. And grade inflation is just a way that teachers are changing their grades and just generating better grades just by artificially having higher grades in time. And to do so to look at this research-driven policies, we look at change and variation in the public investments across time and across space in an intervention, an exogenous intervention in July 2007 in the Netherlands. And we tried to exploit this intervention in which some areas received additional funding, some areas did not receive additional funding, by a difference and differences approach. And we complemented this approach, this empirical approach, with also a theoretical model. In this theoretical model, we can show that there are basically two ways. So first of all, there's increased student performance on the one hand, and on the other hand, there might be some grade inflation over time. So this is predicted by our theoretical model. And if you look at the empirics, so if we do the test in this difference and differences model, we see that this increased resource-driven policies, that this additional money, it affects positively the central exam results, but only if the resources are sufficiently enlarged, so only if there are sufficient money in the system. If it's only a little bit of additional money, additional resources, then we do see that there is a lot of grade inflation. So there is pressure on the schools, pressure on the teachers in order to increase the test scores, and we observe some some grade inflation because of these resource-driven policies. So overall, this is the result of this paper. Overall, it's very difficult to see that resource-driven policies improve educational quality and educational performance. So the answer on this question, how can we improve educational performance, how can we improve the quality of education, it doesn't seem that it's really by resource expansion. On the other hand, so if you look at the Education Inspectorate and if you look at the Education Council reports, it says that we should do more evidence-based education. And so we should examine the effectiveness and efficiency of educational innovations. And these are actually two things, as I stated in the beginning of this talk. Efficiency is doing the right things, so it's doing the things right, so we should try to improve the efficiency, whereas effectiveness is doing the things right, so looking at the objectives, looking at the real outcomes. And those two literatures nowadays, they are quite distinct. So there are two different literatures, they are publishing in two different types of journals, they are working with different methodologies. Like the efficiency literature, it's using mostly non-parametric econometrics, like data and development analysis, semi-parametric techniques like stochastic Frontier analysis, parametric measures such as corrected ordinary squares. And they mainly focus this literature on small improvements on the methodology. So they try to improve the data and development analysis literature, they try to improve how stochastic Frontier models are estimated, but there are small, minor improvements in those modeling techniques. On the other hand, if you look at the effectiveness literature, it's a lot of literature about experimental designs, about quasi-experimental designs, difference and differences, instrumental variables. And this literature mainly focuses on the identification strategies. So what is really the exogenous variation, and how does this exogenous variation results in different outcomes? But they are rather distinct literatures in the sense that few studies combine this efficiency and effectiveness measures. One exception is actually a study by Powell, which looks at a benchmarking model to look at institutional effectiveness and efficiency. Another study is something which I did together with Sergio Perelman and Laurence Cherchy. And we consider resource constraints as a way to combine efficiency and effectiveness. And I'm going to talk you a little bit into this other study. So in this study, we look at the ratio between efficiency and effectiveness. So we look at the ratio between performance and productivity. And performance is here measured in a way that we ignore the inputs. So we ignore the resources and we look just at the outputs, whereas the efficiency is combining inputs and outputs. And by taking this ratio, we obtain very insightful outcomes. We obtain insightful outcomes because we can compare the input constraints and we can see whether input constraints are really there, whether there are really input constraints or not. And so we obtain, for instance, information if the productivity scores are higher than the performance scores. We obtain information whether output expansions matter. So there can be output expansion without, for instance, constraints. Or the opposite holds if the productivity is smaller than the performance increase, such that observation, it doesn't really exploit its full production capacity. So there is scope for further improvement over there. If you look at the empirics of this paper, we apply this to Dutch schools. So we do have information about 80 Dutch schools in which we have information on the resource constraints, if we have information on the outputs of those schools. And you see that in some of the schools, there are clear resource constraints. So those are the schools at the left-hand side. Those schools, they could benefit simply by adding more resources to those schools. So those schools can obtain higher outcomes in test scores in comparison to the other schools, just by relaxing the resource constraints that those schools have. On the other hand, if you look at the right-hand side of those schools, the majority of those schools, they do have unexploited capacity. So those are schools which have sufficient resources, sufficient money, but they are not really able to exploit these resources, and they can perform better with the given capacities and with the given resources. So if you look also to correlation between those resource constraints and this unexploited capacity, we obtain some insightful information about what type of schools are having the resource constraints or what type of schools do have the unexploited capacity. And one interesting thing which I would like to point out here, because it's relevant for the remainder of the presentation, is that resource overutilization correlates positively to the number of school leavers, so early school leavers. And early school leavers are students which are leaving education without a secondary degree. So they are leaving education without a degree and just getting to the labor market. And this suggests this fact that resource overutilization correlates with early school leaving. This suggests that schools with more early school leavers, they have also more resource constraints. So these are the type of schools which do have resource constraints, and if we would relax a little bit these resource constraints, maybe they could concentrate even better to this reducing of early school leavers. Or if you put it the other way around, because we don't know the direction of the correlation, of course. So if you put it the other way around, schools with stringent resource constraints, they seem to be unable to prevent early school leaving. So anyway, we see that from this correlation that early school leaving is related to this resource constraints. And given the substantial cost of education and given the substantial cost of early school leaving, this suggests that as policymakers we can do more to those schools with those resource constraints, so that they can take action in order to prevent further early school leaving. So this is actually my second point. So my second point was, first we try to improve the quality of education. It's not because we can just simply give more money to the schools. We should look at evidence-based education. We should try to examine the effectiveness and efficiency of educational innovations. But on the other hand, early work of mine also shows that we can provide better incentives. And better incentives, I first deal with better incentives by measuring educational performance in a better way. And we know from principal-agent theories, so theories which shows that the principal, so the ones who's handing over the money to the agents, so the teachers, the schools, the students, that it's very difficult to align those incentives to those agents. And if we have those principal-agent theories, that we should try to measure the performance of the agent in a very accurate way. If it's not measured in a very accurate way, then you get diffused results, and it's very difficult as a principal to monitor exactly what the agent is doing. And exactly this thing, so measuring in an accurate way, this is very problematic in the context of education. And I give you an example of my earlier work with Niki Roge, in which we try to look at the evaluation of teachers. So we try to evaluate teachers by giving teachers a score. This is very popular in many education systems like Portugal, like Flanders, like US, like Netherlands, in which we try to measure how teachers are doing. So we are, as a teacher, we are assessed, and we try to see what is the performance of the teacher. But this kind of evaluations, both at higher education, both at secondary education, they are very controversial. And they are controversial because they are typically observed as rather unfair. So people think that it's unfair because they are teaching a different course, they are teaching a different type of group, they are teaching in different environments, etc. So it's considered always as a very unfair fact. So also academic research shows that the background characteristics, they do have an effect. So that whether you are teaching at night, for instance, or early in the morning, whether you are teaching mathematics or economics, for instance, it matters. Also, the practical experience of teachers shows that the background characteristics, they matter in the quality of teaching. And this is actually what we try to do. So we look at the performance index of teachers, in which there are various characteristics. So we asked students about 16 questions, and each of those questions are things like the lecture justifies part of the schooling and function of the cultivation or the formation. I learned a lot, I use different didactics, etc. So all kind of things that a teacher should do. But some teachers, of course, they value more the examination. Other teachers, they value more whether it's active instruction. Other teachers, they value more the individual lecture characteristics. So there is actually a lot of heterogeneity in the way we try to examine this, or which we try to have an effect as a teacher yourself. And this is what we try to do in this paper. So we try to weight those dimensions, but not in a univocal way. So not in the same way, with the same weights for everybody, but with different weights which are endogenous, determined by the data. So we give a set of weights which are not subjective, so which are not uniform for everybody, but which can be changed for every evaluated teacher. And as such, we try to make what this phrase of Fraser is at the bottom. So there is no blueprint of an effective teacher. So every teacher has his own way, and every teacher is doing his own way. And that is how we try to look at those efficiency scores, at those performance scores of teachers. And in fact, the model, it works like giving each of those weights, so each of those dimensions, those 16 dimensions, we try to give different weights to each of those dimensions. And the weight is determined if you are performing relatively well in comparison to the other teachers in the sample. We give you a higher weight. If you're performing relatively poor as a teacher in comparison to the other teachers in the sample, we give you a lower weight. And as such, it's an endogenous weighting system in which every teacher is getting the best weights possible. So every teacher is actually put into the sunshine, as we call them, and every teacher is getting the highest weight possible to maximize the student evaluation of the teacher. And this yields some very large advantages. So this yields first inherent flexibility. So it's a flexible model. It allows for differentiation across teachers and variation across teachers. It's endogenous in the weighting system, so we don't have to impose any paternalistic weights. So we don't have to say, as a faculty board, for instance, this is the weighting system for all teachers, but we will allow for this change across teacher. It's better description of reality rather than an equal weighting model, for instance, or any weighting model, because every teacher is working differently. It allows for the diversity among teachers, and we also allow for the operational environment to change by applying conditional efficiency models, as I developed with Mika Kortelainen. And so this is actually a way in which you show that if you if you are able to estimate things different, and if you're able to estimate performance of teachers and of researchers, we extended this to researchers as well, if you're able to measure this more accurately, you can also obtain a better score and a better performance measure of evaluated persons. And this of such creates incentives for all of the people. In the same way, use for naming and shaming strategies. So naming and shaming is actually a very important and a popular tool in many supranational organizations. So if you look at the OECD performance measures, if you look at European performance measures, in very occasions, those institutes, they are naming and shaming countries or schools or students. They are naming the good ones, saying these are performing well. They are shaming the bad ones. They are performing less well. And even in the case of early school leaving, which is actually a very unidimensional and rather easy way to measure. So it's simple whether you're in school or whether you're not in school. If you do have a degree, you're not an early school leaver. If you don't have a degree, you are an early school leaver. So it's a very simple, unidimensional and uniform performance measure. But even in case of early school leaving, it's very important to control for this heterogeneity across people. It's very important to control for the heterogeneity of the underlying performance. And this is what I did in work with Sofika Bus. So we used, again, insights from the efficiency analysis, from the efficiency literature, to look at performance measures. And we tried to look at, for instance, Las Pires index and Tornquist indexes, which are indices which are very frequently used in this efficiency literature, and we applied them to this effectiveness literature and making a kind of benchmarking approach. So we suggested a benchmarking approach in which countries are evaluated against other countries, but we corrected for time invariant, country invariant effects, as well as for economic conditions. And in this paper, we show that if you don't correct for this heterogeneity across countries, and if you don't correct for those underlying variables, that you obtain biased results, and that you might name the wrong countries, or that you might shame the wrong countries. And that this kind of output indicators, these row output indicators, like they are very frequently used in the European Commission and OECD data, that they are actually wrong, and as such they might provide biased incentives. So this brings me to kind of conclusion of my earlier work. So there are various things that I tried to research. So first of all, the resource-driven policies as such, they don't work. So we need to give either sufficient money such that there can be real changes in the system. Otherwise, we should look more to effectiveness and efficiency of educational innovations. I tried to argue that the concepts of efficiency and efficiency are clearly interrelated, so that we can learn from both literatures and that the literatures can benefit from each other. I also tried to argue, and it's in the booklet, I didn't discuss it here, but educational services, it's a clear example of co-production, in which if the student doesn't participate in the assessment and if the student doesn't participate in the educational outcomes, then there is fewer production, fewer outputs, and we shouldn't ignore this co-production of services in the assessment of educational performance. Fourth, I try to argue that the efficiency analysis allows us, so insights from the efficiency analysis allows us to measure more accurately the performance of observations, such that we can give better incentives to observations, like schools, like teachers, like countries. And then in this kind of incentives models, we should try to include the heterogeneity of the underlying population. This brings me to what I would like to do in the future. So what was this chair about? So this chair is actually combining those two puzzles, so those two pieces of a puzzle, the efficiency and effectiveness. And I think it's rather unique, this chair in this perspective. So combining efficiency with effectiveness and combining those insights from both streams of literature. And by applying them to the educational literature, I hope that there will be novel papers coming out of that and novel research lines, because they can both benefit from each other. And so I will try to rigorously show how those two streams can benefit from each other. One example, for instance, where I worked on with Chris van Klaveren is the combination of matching and conditional efficiency analysis. So in matching and conditional efficiency analysis, we argue in this paper that they have clear similarities. Matching, for instance, it's an example from the effectiveness literature. It focuses on the effect of a treatment, Whereas if you look at conditional efficiency analysis, which comes from the efficiency literature, it's focused on the relative efficiency of observations. But they do have clear similarities. So matching, for instance, it searches by kernel estimations whether a treated observation is similar or not to an evaluated observations. Whereas conditional efficiency analysis, again, they use kernel estimations to look at how they attach weight, and as such, how comparable they are in the efficiency analysis. And I think by similar examples, by combining insights from efficiency with effectiveness, we can obtain better insights and we can expand this literature. So nowadays, for instance, the efficiency literature is mainly focused on how should we improve those conditional efficiency estimates, whereas it can be much broader if you would look at this more advanced effectiveness literature. Besides similar methodological advances, I think there's also some empirical research lines which might be very policy relevant. So first of all, for instance, the organization of school districts. So school districts, they do have a very important role in the way we teach, in the way we organize the schools, and in the way we have different outcomes observations. And the question, of course, is, given the organization of schools, how can we improve the organization of schools in the school districts, and how can we influence the effectiveness of that? So how does this influence the learning outcomes? How does it influence early school leaving? There are some glimpses in my earlier work on that, but I think it can be better developed, and I think there can be many things to be done such that we can effectively improve education in this sense. A second research line which can be further developed, or which will be further developed in this chair, is underachievement, and as an extreme form is early school leaving. Early school leaving has tremendous costs to society, both for the individual, both for society, and I think that it can be a very interesting research line to further develop in this chair. Together, so next to methodological advances, next to research streams, I think the research community can also benefit from all kinds of network activities which can be developed. And I think the earlier workshop, so many of you who participated in the earlier workshop, it shows that we can create a kind of vivid research environment in which both people from efficiency analysis as well as from effectiveness analysis are coming together. And one of the examples, for instance, is the Economics of Education network, which is recently established between University of Leuven, Milan, and Budapest, in which we try to organize workshops for doctoral students, in which we try to organize a community and this community building in order to further develop this kind of literature. I think also the TIER graduate program is an example of this network activity. So in TIER, we try to establish a graduate program in order to attract PhD students and in order to further develop the theme of effectiveness and efficiency. And I think that's another example of creating a research community on this themes of efficiency and effectiveness. And lastly, I think that also visiting scholars, we can create a more vivid environment for visiting scholars in order to foster the research lines in this chair. So finally, I think that I really believe that together, we as a research community, the people who are attended the conference, and I think that it's a very nice example of how we can exchange ideas and how we can really try to improve the educational system in an effective and in a very efficient way. So this brings me to the end of this presentation. I think I wouldn't be standing here without a lot of people who helped me on this puzzle on the efficiency and effectiveness. And I think there are many people who I should really thank. So first of all, the rector of the university, Luc Soete, for allowing me to stand here, but also Professor Frans Palm, the dean of our faculty, and his predecessor, Professor Harm Hosters, for allowing this chair and for having me on this chair. But I think also Wim Groot and Harriet Maassen van der Brink. So those are the two people who started with this TIER and who really believed, both in TIER, who really believed in myself. And I think this is a really critical success factor in success. People who stand behind you and who believe in what you're doing. So thank you very much for this. And I think at an earlier stage there was also Wim Moesen, who was the advisor of my PhD thesis. He's also one of the people who stands behind you, who asks at a very regular basis how it is, how it works. So I would like to thank him as well. I also would like to thank the participants of the workshop. So it shows that there's a very vivid community, a very active community. but also the many colleagues and friends in Leuven and in Maastricht. So I think with most of you, we do have very good discussions, very in-depth discussions, very critical discussions, and this definitely helps to create a kind of research environment which is very attractive to work in, and which also creates better products, which creates better papers, and which improves the quality of our work. And I would like to thank also my more than 40 different co-authors. So I think we do have a very nice network of collaborating and exchanging ideas, collaborating on different teams, but also collaborating on different projects. And I think that's a very nice way of working, and it's a very effective and efficient way of working as well. And finally, I would like to thank my parents for being here, but also for believing in me and for giving a lot of opportunities from day to day, opportunities from back in the very early stage at my youth. So I think I wouldn't be here, this chair wouldn't exist, I guess, without you as a parents believing in me. And I would like to thank my wife Karen for allowing to me to work, to do a lot of things, to believe in me in all kind of different aspects. So I would like to thank all of you for this kind of contributing to this puzzle of efficiency analysis, in each in your own way, each at your own procedures, etc. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Professor de Witte, with this inaugural lecture, you accepted the professorship in the field of effectiveness and efficiency of educational innovations. I learned there's plenty of work to do. Many issues, many important issues have to be analyzed and studied. I'm pretty sure you will be successful. I congratulate you with your professorship and I wish you much success, and I'm sure the enthusiasm that you showed us this afternoon is an important condition for success with your research and the teaching activities that go with it. Thank you very much. I now close this academic session.